You were never meant to hear this. Even now, I hesitate because once the words leave my mouth, you cannot unhear them. Mexico, 1892. A mansion on Tuba Street in the heart of Mexico City. Elegant stone walls, iron balconies, marble floors polished by candlelight. But from inside those walls came sounds so grotesque that even the policemen hardened by executions, revolts, and slaughter claimed they woke in cold sweats years later, still hearing the echoes. They weren't gunshots, not riots, not the violence of the streets. They were screams, children's screams, agonized, shredded, inhuman screams that made even grown men freeze in the street, their blood turning to ice as if the city itself were warning them to turn away. Behind those walls lived Guadalupe Bejarano. On the surface, a widow of wealth and refinement, a devout Catholic, a benefactor to the church, a woman whose word was respected among the elites of Porfirio Diaz, Mexico. But beneath the black veil of her widow's weeds lurked something unspeakable, a mind that had weaponized obedience, a soul that saw suffering not as tragedy, but as opportunity, and a hand that forged Mexico's first serial killings into something more than just crime. It became ritual. Understand this, Guadalupe was not a creature of sudden madness. She was methodical. She crafted her cruelty with precision. She did not break social boundaries recklessly, she exploited them. In a city divided between glittering European boulevards and starving indigenous tenements, she saw the perfect laboratory. Families desperate to survive sent their daughters to her household for work. No papers, no records, no one powerful enough to question if they disappeared. To the world, Guadalupe was their savior. In truth, she was their executioner. But here's the darker truth they don't teach in history books. Guadalupe was not simply killing. She was experimenting. She called it her method of training. Every scream, every drop of blood, every broken child was data in her private research into domination. She saw herself as more than a woman. She saw herself as a force. And forces, unlike people, leave echoes that do not die. If you continue watching, you step into her mansion. You will hear the screams. You will see the hidden face of control itself. And once you do, you cannot turn back. To understand Guadalupe Bejarano, you must understand the mask she wore. Mexico City in the late 19th century was a place obsessed with appearances. President Diaz paraded the nation as modern, European, civilized. The wealthy mimicked Parisian fashions, sent their children to elite schools, decorated their homes with French furniture, while the poor starved in slums just a few blocks away. Respectability was currency. Appearances were armor. And Guadalupe mastered both. She dressed in widow's black, every fold of her garments radiating solemn dignity. She crossed herself in church with impeccable timing, her rosary beads glinting like chains of virtue. Her donations to charity earned her praise in sermons. Neighbors spoke of her discipline, her order, her strength as a model of Catholic womanhood. Every Sunday she sat in the same pew, lips pressed in piety, eyes lowered like a soldier of God. She knew exactly what society wanted to see, and she gave it to them flawlessly. But behind the locked doors of her mansion, Guadalupe shed that skin. There, she was not the grieving widow. She was the architect. Every act of torture was staged as if in a theater only she could appreciate. The polished marble halls muffled the sounds. The crucifixes on the walls became silent witnesses to her private liturgy. She called it instruction. But what she was cultivating was obedience through annihilation. The duality was not an accident. It was the strategy. Respectability gave her protection. Status gave her invisibility. The very institutions meant to preserve morality, church, class, family, shielded her from suspicion. After all, who would accuse a wealthy widow, a benefactor to the poor, of monstrous acts against the very children she claimed to uplift? The truth is, society did not simply overlook her crimes. It enabled them, provided her with victims. It whispered reassurances that the world was in order, while screams bled into the night behind stone walls. And here is the revelation most men cannot bear. Evil does not always come in the form of chaos. Sometimes it dresses in order, smiles in prayer, and kneels at the altar beside you. That is why so many never saw her for what she was. She reflected their values back at them, and beneath that reflection she carved her empire of pain. Guadalupe Bejarano was not just Mexico's first serial killer. She was a mirror, and the society that revered her image was staring into its own blindness. Guadalupe did not see herself as a murderer at first. Murder was too crude, too final. What fascinated her was control, the art of shaping another human being into something pliant, something broken, something hers. Killing ended the experiment. But obedience could be stretched, molded, perfected. That was her true obsession. She called it training. The neighbors thought it meant teaching poor girls domestic skills, how to polish silver, iron linens, prepare meals for Mexico's wealthiest families. But inside her mansion, training was redefined. A girl might be forced to kneel on stone floors for hours until her legs trembled. She might be denied water on scorching summer days until her lips cracked and bled. Tasks were deliberately sabotaged, dust sprinkled on freshly cleaned furniture, wrinkles pressed into smooth sheets so Guadalupe could scold, humiliate, punish. Every mistake was designed, every correction calculated. She catalogued reactions. Who cried first? Who begged? Who resisted? She noted the exact breaking point when pride gave way to silence, when resistance gave way to surrender. It was not random cruelty, it was research. A system, a science of obedience conducted behind locked doors while the church praised her generosity. And she had an audience. Her son, Aurelio, thin and pale, haunted the upper floors like a shadow. He learned early that silence was survival, that looking into his mother's glittering eyes meant danger. He developed a stutter, a dependency on laudanum to numb the nightmares. But even he could not fully escape the sounds that rose from below, the whip crack of leather, the muffled cries, the dragging of footsteps. In him, Guadalupe saw proof of her power. A son so broken he could not oppose her, only hide behind trembling hands. But it was the girls, the young, desperate servants, that provided the clearest data. Each one was stripped of identity, remade into an object for her will. They arrived hopeful, grateful, faithful. Within weeks, they became hollow-eyed, obedient, conditioned. Their suffering was not random violence, it was ritualized, repeated, refined. And here is the terror that still lingers in her story. Guadalupe was not only creating victims. She was studying human weakness itself. She was mapping the architecture of fear. She was proving that obedience could be extracted not by love, not by loyalty, but by the systematic erosion of dignity. It was not madness. It was method, and that method would end in blood. The line between punishment and death was always thinner than it seemed. For years, Guadalupe skirted its edge, her punishments brutal but survivable, her cruelty intense but not yet terminal. It gave her deniability. If a girl collapsed, she could claim illness, frailty, weakness. But on a gray January morning in 1887, that veil tore apart. Her name was Casimira Juarez, 16 years old, an orphan from Michoacan, sent to the city with a priest's letter of recommendation and a bundle of clothes wrapped in cloth. She believed she was entering the house of a benefactor. In reality, she was stepping into a crucible. Guadalupe's eyes studied her from the very first knock on the heavy wooden door. Too polite, too grateful, too eager to please. Perfect. For 2 weeks, Casimira followed every order, eager to prove herself. But Guadalupe was never looking for competence, she was looking for cracks. Soon, the girl was accused of invisible mistakes. Dust no one else could see, wrinkles that did not exist, meals that were flawless yet unacceptable. Each accusation led to harsher instruction. Kneeling until her joints swelled, scrubbing until her hands split. Denied meals, denied sleep, denied comfort. Slowly, the girl's spirit thinned like paper. And then came the night. Guadalupe escalated the session beyond the usual limits. Casimira had stumbled weak, dizzy, exhausted, and the slip became the justification. Guadalupe bound her, beat her, starved her further, watching as the girl's will faltered. But this time she did not stop. She wanted to see what came after surrender. She wanted to cross the invisible line. Casimira's body gave out before her spirit did. When she died, Guadalupe did not panic. She observed. The corpse was simply the natural conclusion of an experiment pushed too far. To her, it was not tragedy, it was confirmation. She had mapped the full descent of obedience, from resistance to silence, from silence to death. And in death, she discovered something new: exhilaration. The disposal was simple. Mexico City teemed with anonymity. A girl with no papers, no family, no voice, she was absorbed into the void of poverty. A disappearance, not a crime. And Guadalupe, widow of status, patroness of the church, pillar of society, remained untouchable. Understand this. In her mind, murder was not crime. It was progress. It was the logical conclusion of her method. That night, Guadalupe crossed the threshold. And once she stepped over, she never looked back. One death was never going to be enough. For a woman like Guadalupe, the first murder was not a climax, it was a revelation. It showed her the limit of the experiment, and once she saw that limit, she wanted to test it again. Not by accident this time, but by design. And so the cycle began. Girls kept arriving. Mexico's hunger ensured it. Parents in villages saw Guadalupe as a savior, offering respectable employment when the fields could no longer feed them. Priests handed over orphans with relief, trusting her piety. Each arrival was another subject, another opportunity to refine the method. The pattern hardened into ritual. A new girl would enter the house, wide-eyed, clutching a bundle of clothes. Guadalupe would greet her with solemn warmth, the mask of charity firmly in place. She would walk her through the halls of marble and crucifixes, showing her a clean bed, promising fair treatment in exchange for obedience. The girl would feel relief, gratitude, even hope. That was the first stage, trust. Then the fault-finding would begin. Invisible dust, imagined incompetence, fabricated disrespect. The girl would apologize, work harder, try to please. That was the second stage, destabilization. Punishments followed. Kneeling for hours, sleep deprivation, starvation, humiliation. Each act designed to test endurance, to measure compliance. That was the third stage, conditioning. And then, inevitably, the breaking point. Some would collapse into hollow submission, their eyes vacant, their bodies mechanical. Others would resist longer, begging, crying, trembling. Guadalupe recorded it all, mentally charting who cracked sooner, who held out longer, what precise mixture of hunger and pain produced total obedience. That was the fourth stage, revelation. And when she decided they had served their purpose, when there was nothing left to measure, when obedience had been reduced to silence, she ended it. Not in rage, not in frenzy, but with the calm detachment of a scientist closing an experiment. That was the final stage, elimination. The bodies vanished into the shadows of Mexico City. A servant who returned home, a girl who fell ill, an orphan lost in the streets. No records, no outcry. Each disappearance folded neatly into the chaos of a city where the poor vanished daily. Society itself became her accomplice, swallowing the evidence whole. Understand the scale of this. Guadalupe had turned murder into process. Not random, not impulsive. A cycle, a machine. Behind the stone walls of her mansion, she was no longer just a widow maintaining her household, she was an empress of suffering, building an empire of silence. Guadalupe's genius was not only in breaking the bodies of young girls. It was in testing the body of the nation itself. Every disappearance, every muffled scream behind her walls was not just an act of violence, it was a question whispered into the heart of Mexico. How much darkness will you ignore if it comes dressed in respectability? The answer, again and again, was silence. Neighbors spoke of the screams, yes, but always in hushed tones, always with a nervous glance over the shoulder. The police, when they were called, preferred to dismiss rumors rather than risk offending a woman of Guadalupe's social rank. Priests blessed her, praised her, relied on her donations. Judges and businessmen shook her hand in public, spoke of her strength and discipline. Every institution that should have protected the vulnerable instead turned away, blinded by the power of status. And Guadalupe knew it. She studied the reactions of the city just as carefully as she studied the tears of her servants. If no one confronted her, it meant the system itself had accepted her cruelty. If whispers never became accusations, it proved that the architecture of Mexico's respectability was stronger than the cries of the powerless. In this way, her experiment expanded beyond the walls of her mansion. She wasn't only refining obedience in her victims, she was refining obedience in the society that enabled her. Think of it, the masks of power are always double-sided. The wealthy appeared moral, pious, civilized, while in truth they relied on the suffering of the poor to uphold their illusions. Guadalupe was not an aberration in that system. She was its mirror. Her method was not so different from the government's modernization projects that displaced peasants, or the church's endless calls for sacrifice from the poor while the elite dined in luxury. She simply stripped away the pretense and showed it in raw, bloody form. That is why her story matters. Because the question Guadalupe posed to her society is the same question every society faces. How far will you allow evil to hide, so long as it wears the mask of virtue? In Mexico, the answer was chillingly clear, and Guadalupe thrived in that silence. Whispers do not stay contained. In a city like Mexico, they flow through the markets, the cantinas, the churches like smoke seeping through cracks in a wall. And soon the name Guadalupe Bejarano began to carry a strange double meaning. To the wealthy, it was still a name of dignity, of social standing, of pious widowhood. But to the poor, the maids, the laborers, the beggars, it became something darker. A warning. A story mothers whispered to daughters. Don't go to the mansion on Tuba Street. Don't trust the woman in black. Don't be fooled by her prayers. Rumor reshaped her into legend. Some said she drank the blood of the girls to keep her skin pale and unwrinkled. Others claimed she was in league with the devil, that her crucifixes were inverted at night, that the screams were part of unholy rituals disguised as penance. Her mansion became mythic stone walls hiding a labyrinth of chains, a kitchen where every floorboard was stained red. She was no longer just a woman. She was La Terrible, the terrifying one. And then came the artists. Among them, José Guadalupe Posada, the engraver who immortalized death itself in skeletal form. He was fascinated by stories that revealed the grotesque beneath respectability, and Bejarano's cruelty became one of his inspirations. His illustrations of grim skeletons dressed in aristocratic clothing, mocking the hypocrisy of the elite, were haunted by echoes of her reality. In those images, the mask of refinement was stripped away, revealing the rot beneath. Art became the mirror that whispered what polite society refused to speak aloud. But myths are dangerous because they blur the line between truth and invention. The more grotesque the stories became, the easier it was for the powerful to dismiss them. Ridiculous rumors, they said. Superstitions from the poor. By exaggerating her into a demon, society allowed the very real, very human monster to remain untouched. And this is the paradox. Guadalupe's crimes lived in the streets as nightmare and folklore, while her actual hands remained clean in the eyes of the law. She was a ghost in both worlds, feared as a legend, respected as a lady. And it was in that twilight space, between fact and fable, that her power grew strongest. Because when a monster becomes myth, no one dares to confront her directly. Every empire of fear has its weakest link. For Guadalupe, it was not the neighbors who whispered or the priests who praised her generosity. It was her son, Aurelio. From the outside, he was barely visible. A thin young man of 22, pale, withdrawn, moving like a shadow through the halls of the mansion. Most assumed his melancholy was grief for his dead father. Others dismissed him as frail, too delicate for the demands of public life. But those who glanced closer saw something else. Trembling hands, darting eyes, the stutter that clamped his throat shut whenever anyone asked about the household. Aurelio had grown up in the echo of screams. He had been raised in a house where silence was survival, where a wrong look from his mother could mean hours of torment. He had learned to numb himself with laudanum, drowning memory in chemical haze. But the body keeps score. Nightmares clawed at him. He heard Casimira's muffled cries in his dreams. He saw faces of vanished girls staring at him with hollow eyes, demanding answers he could not give. His mind began to fray, and Guadalupe noticed. She saw his weakness as she saw all things clearly, analytically, with a cold detachment. "You are soft," she would hiss. "Do you think anyone will protect you without me? Do you think the world will treat you kindly if you betray this house?" Her words were chains, binding him tighter than any rope. He obeyed out of fear, out of dependence, out of the belief that survival meant silence. But the mask was cracking. Servants whispered about his shaking hands, his haunted stare. Neighbors caught glimpses of him pacing at night, mumbling broken fragments of confession to the shadows. And once, just once, he tried to speak to a priest who had come to bless the house. His stutter betrayed him, choking his words into nonsense. The priest left with only a vague unease, while Guadalupe's eyes burned holes through her son. For the first time, the danger of exposure was real. Not from the authorities, not from society, but from within. Aurelio was the ghost in her machinery, the trembling witness to every horror she had refined. If he broke, if he spoke, her empire of obedience could collapse. And Guadalupe knew it, which meant Aurelio's silence had to be enforced not by chains, but by fear so deep it became indistinguishable from loyalty. Guadalupe understood something most tyrants learn too late. Silence cannot be trusted unless it is earned through terror. Her victims in the servants' quarters proved that obedience could be manufactured. But her son presented a unique problem. Aurelio was bound to her by blood, but blood alone did not guarantee loyalty. And loyalty to Guadalupe was worthless unless it was absolute. So she began to test him. At first it was subtle. She would summon him during instruction sessions, forcing him to stand in the corner while she humiliated a servant girl. His stutter worsened as he tried not to react, his eyes fixed on the floor while the girl screamed. If he flinched, if his face betrayed sympathy, Guadalupe's gaze would turn on him like a blade. "Do you pity her?" she would ask. And the question was not really a question. It was a threat. Soon the tests became direct. Aurelio was ordered to deliver punishments himself, slaps, kicks, tasks designed to implicate him. His hands shook, but he obeyed. Not because he wanted to, but because defiance meant becoming the victim himself. And in that moment, Guadalupe accomplished something more sinister than cruelty. She made him complicit. The logic was flawless. A boy who shares the blood on his hands cannot later testify against her. A witness who has been turned into a participant cannot reveal the crime without condemning himself. And so Aurelio's silence deepened, not as an act of weakness, but as a prison she had carefully built around him. But cruelty has side effects, and Guadalupe did not account for the corrosion eating away at his mind. Aurelio's nights grew darker. He drowned himself in laudanum, waking in sweats, his sheets soaked as though his body was trying to purge what his soul could not. He saw the girls in every shadow. He heard his mother's voice in every silence. He was collapsing under the weight of guilt and terror, trapped in a house where even breathing felt like betrayal. And yet, this too pleased her. His weakness was proof of her strength. His trembling, his dependence, his fear, they were evidence that her power extended beyond her victims. She had colonized her own son's soul. In Guadalupe's mansion, family was not sanctuary. Family was just another proving ground, another experiment, another body to bend, another will to break. For years, Guadalupe's cruelty had thrived in shadow, hidden by respectability, protected by fear. But shadows cannot remain impenetrable forever. Every empire of silence eventually meets the moment when whispers become too loud, too numerous, too undeniable. And for Guadalupe, that moment was approaching. It began with the bodies that never returned. Servant girls vanished, their families told they had run away or found work elsewhere. But poor families keep track of their own. Mothers went from house to house, searching for daughters who had vanished after entering Guadalupe's mansion. Fathers muttered in taverns, fists clenched around cups of pulque, insisting something darker was at play. At first, these were dismissed as the ramblings of the desperate. But when the stories multiplied, they formed a pattern that even the city could no longer ignore. Neighbors had long heard screams, thin, desperate cries carried by the night air. Some convinced themselves it was imagination. Others told themselves discipline was simply stricter in a wealthy household. But guilt festers, and slowly, the neighbors began speaking not just in whispers but in murmurs that reached beyond the street. They told priests. They told minor officials. They told anyone who would listen that something wasn't right in Guadalupe's home. The church, too, began to hesitate. Priests who once praised her generosity now squirmed under the weight of rumors. Guadalupe's donations bought their silence. But silence itself was becoming a burden. A few dared to ask cautious questions, not accusations. Not yet, but subtle probes. Was she truly as pious as she appeared? Was discipline in her household harsher than most? These doubts were quiet, but they were there. And then came the moment society could not ignore. A servant girl escaped. Her body was frail, her spirit shattered, but her voice carried enough terror to confirm what many had already suspected. She spoke of beatings, of punishments that blurred into torture, of screams no prayer could silence. Her testimony was fragmented, half-choked by fear, but it was enough. The city began to tremble. What if the woman they had admired, the benefactress who dressed in fine black lace and recited prayers with flawless devotion, was in truth a predator? What if Mexico's very idea of respectability was a mask, and Guadalupe was proof of the horror that could hide behind it? It was not yet exposure, but it was the first real fracture. A society built on silence had finally begun to listen, and in that listening, Guadalupe's power stood on the edge of collapse. For another woman, the first whispers of exposure might have meant retreat. For Guadalupe, they were a challenge. Suspicion was not an end but an opportunity, a test of whether her mask could withstand the heat of truth. And in that test, she revealed just how formidable she truly was. Her strategy was as ruthless as her punishments. She weaponized the very things that had protected her from the beginning: wealth, piety, and the machinery of respectability. First, she leaned harder into charity. Coins in the hands of priests, food for the poor, generous alms distributed in public squares. Her name was whispered in sermons as an example of Christian devotion, her black-veiled figure a symbol of humility. Those who doubted her now faced the uncomfortable truth that condemning Guadalupe meant condemning one of the church's most visible benefactors. Next, she tightened her grip on officials. Judges were invited to banquets where the wine flowed freely, their pockets fattened discreetly under the table. Police captains found themselves with new favors, gifts, or promises of protection. To accuse Guadalupe was to risk one's career, one's livelihood. The machinery of the state bent easily under her hand. But her most powerful weapon was fear. Neighbors who had whispered too loudly found subtle threats at their door: an anonymous warning, a smashed window, a sudden disappearance of employment. Families who had lost daughters learned to keep quiet, knowing that Guadalupe's reach extended further than they could imagine. Silence was enforced not just within her walls, but across the city itself. And then there was the performance of faith. Guadalupe turned her house into a stage. She hosted prayer circles, invited priests to dine, cultivated the image of a widow cloaked in grief yet devoted to God. Her rosary beads clicked like chains in her hands, each prayer masking the echo of screams that still stained her walls. The more suspicion grew, the more pious she appeared, and the more society doubted itself. Because to accuse her was not merely to accuse a woman. It was to accuse the very idea of respectability, the illusion that the wealthy and devout were moral by default. And that was something most people were too afraid to confront. So suspicion grew louder, but so did Guadalupe's mask. She transformed doubt into a mirror, forcing society to look away rather than admit what was hiding in plain sight. And in this battle between whispers and appearances, the truth itself became the first casualty. The greatest dangers to Guadalupe were never the neighbors or the priests or the judges whose palms she filled with silver. The greatest dangers lived in her house. They were the ghosts she herself had created, the living remnants of cruelty that no amount of prayer or charity could silence. The first was Aurelio. His unraveling, once a private tremor, had become a collapse that even Guadalupe's iron grip could not fully contain. Laudanum dulled his edges but did not erase the cracks. He wandered the mansion at night, muttering fragments of confession, eyes wide as if chasing specters only he could see. Servants whispered that he conversed with the dead, that he answered voices that were not there. He had become a liability, a walking fracture line in her empire of silence. And though she scorned his weakness, even Guadalupe could not ignore the danger. Her son was no longer merely complicit. He was unstable. Then there was Casimira. Once the obedient servant girl, she had learned that survival was not only about submission. Quietly, invisibly, she developed her own kind of defiance. She obeyed with her body but resisted with her mind. She remembered. She carried the stories of the vanished. She endured each humiliation with an iron stillness that unnerved even Guadalupe. Because silence can mean fear, but it can also mean witness. Casimira's eyes, dark and unflinching, began to haunt Guadalupe more than the screams ever had. They were proof that cruelty does not erase memory, it only carves it deeper. Together, Aurelio and Casimira represented the cracks Guadalupe could not control. Aurelio was the fracture of bloodline, the proof that her legacy was rotting from within. Casimira was the fracture of servitude, the reminder that even in obedience there are seeds of rebellion. And both were watching her, carrying truths she could not smother with wealth, or prayer, or threats. The house itself began to change under their weight. Rooms felt colder, shadows longer. Servants avoided the corridors at night, muttering of curses, of spirits restless from the blood spilled within. Guadalupe dismissed this as superstition, but deep down, she too felt the pressure. Not guilt, never guilt, but unease. An awareness that control, no matter how absolute it seemed, was slipping through her hands like sand. The mask that had convinced a city could not save her from the ghosts inside her own home. And for the first time, Guadalupe's fortress of silence no longer felt impenetrable. Felt fragile, haunted, alive with the very cracks she had created. The house on Tuba Street had always been Guadalupe's fortress: stone walls, iron balconies, heavy curtains drawn against the city. But fortresses can become prisons. And prisons, when filled with screams and silence, can become haunted. By 1891, the air inside that mansion seemed to breathe against its mistress, pressing back with a weight she could not shake. Aurelio was the first fracture to break into daylight. For years, he had been the silent shadow, the stuttering son hidden behind curtains and bottles of laudanum. But repression is not erasure. One afternoon, during Mass, with Mexico's most respectable families gathered beneath vaulted ceilings and incense smoke, Aurelio erupted. He rose from the pew mid-sermon, trembling, his voice fractured yet shrill, shouting words that clawed through the sanctuary. "Blood! She drinks it. She burns them alive. Don't you see?" The congregation gasped, scandal rippling like fire across dry grass. Guadalupe's face froze into a mask of piety, her hand gripping his shoulder so tightly it left purple imprints. She dragged him out with the composure of a grieving mother, whispering of illness, of fragile nerves. But the words were loose now, floating in ears that could not forget. And whispers, once born, do not die. Casimira too had shifted. She had been the obedient shadow, moving silently through halls, accepting pain with bowed head. But now her silence carried a different weight, less submission, more defiance. She had begun to write, scraps of paper hidden beneath floorboards, prayers twisted into testimony. She documented everything: the punishments, the screams, the names of the vanished. A chronicle in secret, each word a weapon sharp enough to pierce Guadalupe's mask if ever uncovered. And though Guadalupe suspected, though she prowled the girls' quarters with suspicion thick in her throat, she found nothing. Casimira's silence had become a war Guadalupe could not win. The mansion itself mirrored their rebellion. Doors groaned louder than they should have. echoing down marble corridors. Windows rattled in still air, as though some unseen presence pressed against the glass. Servants whispered that the girls who vanished had returned in spirit, walking at night, leaving wet footprints across the stone floors. Guadalupe scoffed at such tales, but even she found herself lighting more candles than usual, clutching her rosary with unfamiliar urgency. She had built her empire on silence, but now the silence had turned on her. It no longer protected, it accused. Every creak of the house, every tremor in Aurelio's voice, every unflinching glance from Casimira felt like judgment. And judgment, she knew, was the one thing even power could not silence forever. The collapse came not as a whisper, but as a storm. For years Guadalupe had mastered the art of control, of silence, of masks, of calculated cruelty hidden beneath velvet respectability. But control, once strained past its limits, shatters with violence. And when it did, the house on Tuba Street became less a home than a battlefield. Aurelio was the first to ignite the descent. His mind, corroded by laudanum and nightmares, broke past all boundaries. On a night when the city outside celebrated a saint's feast, fireworks bursting red and gold above Mexico City, Aurelio burst into the servants' quarters below. His body shook, his voice raw, as he screamed names: Casimira's, the vanished girls, his own. They never left. They're still here. She feeds on them. His fists slammed into walls, his sobs tearing through plaster, until he collapsed into convulsions. Servants fled, terrified, carrying fragments of his words back into the city like sparks. The whispers Guadalupe had held at bay with silver and scripture had now been given form, a body writhing in madness. Casimira struck next not with violence, but with the quiet precision of someone who has learned to wait. Her secret chronicle, pages hidden for months, was finally delivered beyond the house. A sympathetic priest, unsettled by Aurelio's public collapse, received her words in trembling hands. Each line was a blade, detailed, unflinching, naming dates, describing methods, listing girls who never returned. With ink and truth, Casimira transformed from victim into executioner, not of bodies, but of Guadalupe's mask. And then the house itself seemed to join the rebellion. Doors slammed of their own accord. Flames guttered on candle wicks as if choked by unseen hands. Guadalupe paced the corridors with fury, but fury could not stitch the fabric back together. Aurelio had become uncontrollable, a prophet of her hidden empire's rot. Casimira had become untouchable, her words already outside the walls. And the servants, once too frightened to speak, now stared at their mistress not with obedience, but with recognition. They saw her not as Señora Bejarano, the charitable widow, but as what she truly was, La Hiena, the hyena of Tuba Street. That name spread like fire, a name she could not silence, a name that carried the weight of every scream, every vanished child, every shadow that lingered in her mansion. Guadalupe's empire of obedience, built stone by stone on suffering, was collapsing before her eyes. And for the first time, she realized the truth. Power sustained by silence will always die the moment silence turns into voice. The empire of fear that Guadalupe Bejarano had built for decades crumbled like dry stone. Walls that once contained screams now amplified them, echoing across corridors that had once been her kingdom. Aurelio, ravaged by madness, became a living testament to the cost of obedience forced beyond endurance. His breakdown was complete, eyes hollow, voice broken, body trembling with memories too monstrous to suppress. He was no longer her son. He was the living mirror of her cruelty. Casimira, once a shadow of terror, emerged as the instrument of revelation. Her chronicle, passed to sympathetic hands outside the mansion, became the thread that unspooled years of silence. Officials could no longer pretend ignorance. The city, forced to confront the reality it had long ignored, recoiled in disbelief. Guadalupe's carefully constructed facade of piety, wealth, and civility dissolved under scrutiny. The widow who had seemed untouchable now appeared monstrous, stripped of all pretense, exposed for the systematic destruction she had wrought. Yet even in downfall, her story refused to vanish. Artists and storytellers immortalized her terror in illustrations, in whispered legends, in tales told to children as warnings. She became Laibé, the terrifying one, a name both feared and remembered, a figure suspended between myth and history. The mansion on Tuba Street, once her domain, became a symbol of hidden corruption, a place where power and respectability masked unthinkable evil. Those walls, though emptied of living victims, carried the weight of memory, a warning that such darkness does not disappear simply because it is confronted. And that is the final lesson. Guadalupe's fall was inevitable, but her legacy endures. She reminds us that monsters are rarely obvious. They wear masks approved by society, cloaked in piety, wealth, or influence. They test boundaries, exploit silence, and study obedience not merely in those they dominate, but in the systems that allow them to exist. And even after exposure, even after death or disgrace, their shadow lingers, shaping how we perceive authority, trust, and the thin line between civility and cruelty. So when you walk past a house that seems too quiet, a person who seems too polished, or a system that promises virtue while feeding on suffering, remember Guadalupe Bejarano. Remember the empire she built behind closed doors, the sun she shattered, the girls who vanished without a trace. And remember this: the masks of the powerful never truly vanish. They wait, patient, behind the respectability of society, ready for the next observer to underestimate their darkness. Because evil does not die, it only waits for silence to return. Now that you've seen what hides behind respectability, ask yourself how many masks are around you, waiting to be uncovered? Comment below. Silence can hide evil. Say it twice to lock in your awareness and prove you're ready to see the world differently. Guadalupe Bejarano's story is only one of many hidden histories the world doesn't want you to know. Subscribe and hit the bell now. Next, we'll reveal another forgotten empire of control, where the masks of power hide darkness you won't believe exists. I want to hear from you. What truths have you uncovered in your own life that others refuse to see? Share your insights in the comments. The most fearless voices join the conversation here, exploring what society tries to bury. Only the most observant will notice the hidden patterns in Guadalupe's story. If you caught the detail most people miss, type "I see the shadow" twice in the comments. Your mind is ready for the next level of forbidden history.